Hi, welcome to Here to There, hosted by Carolyn Taketa, former attorney, current small groups pastor, and life coach. Through monthly conversations with pastors, authors, and guests, we hope to stir your thoughts and encourage you to move from where you are to where you want to be, in your personal life, in your leadership, or in your ministry.
Welcome to Group Talk. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Taketa. I'm your host and executive director of small groups at Calvary Community Church in Westlake Village, California. Well, a while ago, a small group leader who leads a mixed group of marrieds and singles, mostly divorced people of a similar age group, kind of middle age, shared that she did not feel competent or comfortable to lead the group any longer. And when I asked her why, she just said, I feel so overwhelmed by the needs in this group. So when I asked what happened, because she'd been leading a while, she said the group had recently added 2 people who were going through a divorce, and it just totally changed the dynamics of the group. So as it turned out, they were spending increasing amounts of time on caring for these hurting people who are going through these incredibly difficult circumstances. And over time, it kind of wore on the other members. There was less focus on the Bible study or even other people's issues. And so she was just really torn between wanting to support and encourage these 2 people going through these challenges. But then she's like, I'm not a divorce support recovery group, but they need help. Aren't we supposed to be supporting each other? And so she was just so confused. And the lines had gotten blurred between support group and regular group. And there was all this tension. And, I think regular small groups, which most of us lead, are often challenged by the role of caring for people in crisis or even deeper emotional needs for different seasons or even for a long time. And so over the years, I've really wrestled with this and in counseling her and so many other leaders about what is the role between small groups and support groups. How do we support people and care for people in our small groups in ways that are healthy, but we don't become therapists for them? And they do have different purpose and dynamics. So on today's podcast, we're going to explore these questions and talk about what are the benefits of support groups that we can learn from? What's the dangers to watch out for? How do we keep small groups on track? And what are some triggers that leaders should be watching out for? Just kind of all the issues surrounding what it means to care and support people in our groups. And so I am so glad to have with me on the program is a therapist turned pastor, John Noto. Thank you, John, so much for being on Group Talk.
Absolutely, Carolyn. It's great to join you today.
Yes, the added bonus of John is that not only is he a pastor who serves as a community life pastor at one of Willow Creek Community Church's regional campuses in the Chicago area, and he's been doing that for 6 years, coordinating discipleship and pastoral care, which totally makes sense given your background. So you bring your insights as a therapist to unite both ministries. And prior to serving at Willow, John was a clinical therapist in a variety of settings, including private practice and community mental health. John also writes for online publications. If you've been on smallgroupnetwork.com, you've seen his postings on there. He writes great articles for that, along with smallgroups.com and careleader.org, along with his own website, unwavering.com. So, John, I've got to ask you this before we dive into our conversation. What was the impetus to change from being a therapist to being a pastor?
It's funny you ask that. So really there's 2 main reasons around that. One, if you go back in my story, it's really interesting. I was raised Catholic and kind of left the church, so to speak, in college, as many of us do. But then kind of found my faith again in a non-denominational church, actually in Willow Creek. So there was specifically a time in my life when I felt like this faith thing is so important to me. Maybe I should go into the church. And I can tell you exactly where I was. I was at Loyola University's Lakeshore campus, and all of a sudden, a flock of seminary students walked past me with the white collars, preparing, for the priesthood. And I was dating my now wife at the time, and I literally had the thought, so let's see, wife or ministry? And I chose wife, so I went into psychology instead. So that's
so great.
But also, I love psychology. I'm very passionate about it. I'm passionate about this topic we're talking about today because I think both the church and the world of psychology can learn so much from each other. And working in private practice, there was that element that was missing to me, and it was the element of the open doors. As long as money is involved and insurance is involved, there's so many roadblocks and barriers and challenges, even at Christian practice where I was, that it it can never operate like the church. That's why churches and counselors need each other. My heart was drawn towards the church, and I ended up in a part-time role while I was in practice, which grew and grew and grew, and here I am today.
And here you are. Oh, that's a great story. You know what I love, as you were talking, I was thinking about how much the churches have grown, and we still have ways to go, but in the area of valuing Christian counseling, valuing therapy, I think when I was growing up, it was kind of like, no, you just pray more and you take care of the spiritual side and everything else will work out. But I think we've gotten so much wiser about the interactions and the intersections between those two and kind of the whole person. And so it's so great to see, kind of that juxtaposition come together in the church, because as you said, both pieces have so much to offer, and we're stronger when we have it together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're talking about both pieces today, which is the intersection of your worlds. So let's start off by talking about the definition. Like, how would you define a support group?
Yeah, this is an important we have to take a step back and really look at defining terms before we even talk about anything. Because if you're talking to somebody in the church world, or if you're talking to somebody in the counseling world, or if you're talking to somebody in the recovery world, we all have different jargon, and it's very different. And we know, working in the church, that the church is not free of jargon. We probably have the most jargon. So really, for me, I categorize it into 3 different types of groups. Outside of the church and in a church. So these are broad categories. The first one is, for lack of a better word, I use the word comforting, a comforting group, meaning it's solely a place to come and share and have a sounding board and a group of people to express to. So this is your grief support. Or a lot of times in the community, you'll have caretakers, people with limiting, illnesses, and so long-term caretakers have support groups where they come together. So that's one type of support group is for comforting, and it's kind of a landing place. Another type is what I'll call like the healing group.
Okay.
This is where something's wrong. There's an issue that we need to resolve and kind of get back to baseline. So this would be either a recovery group, a 12-step group therapy falls in this category, where there's a mental illness or there's some factor in life that we need to kind of adjust and get back to baseline. And then this third camp of group, which is where I think the church has a lot to offer, is a growth group. And this is where, our primary purpose, it doesn't mean it's the only thing that's happening, but the primary purpose is taking people who are at a baseline, so to speak, and helping them to do and say and think things they haven't done before. So in kind of counseling world, that would be considered coaching. This is where we bring even another kind of factor in is how do we help somebody be more than they were 6 months ago or a year ago? So in the church world, we see that mirrored, and small groups, Bible studies, things that we would talk about end up in that third category, that growth group.
That's a really good distinction. So in the church, we have the same 3, right? So the comforting groups, that would be like your divorce recovery, your grief support, that's kind of special needs families, that sort of thing, with that being the primary, right? And then, what did you call it? Recovery versus fixing. I guess fixing's kind of a weird word, isn't it? Yes. Fixing is a weird word. So yeah, you can look at it: comforting, addictions, fixing or healing, and growth. Addictions is really, that's going to land in that middle section, that healing group. We're saying with an addiction, whatever it is, and kind of with the Celebrate Recovery movement, with a lot of this, we've widened that umbrella, which is great for the recovery culture. That's when we're saying we're getting together and we're saying there's something, a factor in my life, a relationship in my life, a pattern in my life that is addictive and is causing a loss of function or pain or brokenness, really. And so we're attempting to walk with one another through finding healing in that. You mentioned the word fixing. When we're talking about this healing, bringing back to baseline, I think we can, especially in the church world, I think we can get a little mixed up where what is fixing? What is healing? What does that mean? And we get a little weird around setting goals and getting specific. That's what I've found in church world. Right. Sometimes the more
specific we try to get, that's when we have disagreements around what actually we're trying to go for. But there's a lot of benefit in that too, because until we name something, we're not actually going to have as much positive momentum as we want.
Right. Well, the challenge, of course, is that these three categories don't stay in neat little boxes. They can sometimes merge in someone's life and therefore in their group, right? So you would agree, of course, that support and encouragement is part of every healthy small group, and we're encouraged to do that. Scripture is very clear. So how do small groups do this that's different than what a support group, whichever category they are, within a support group can?
Yeah. I think it's of the utmost importance for us to define purpose. And I don't think any group life director or group life point person would disagree with that point. But I do think that a lot of us have a challenge in what we actually do with that and how that comes about in our ministry. And, so purpose, vision is, high level importance, because if we don't have that dialed in, and it doesn't mean it has to be narrow, but it does mean that we have to have thought well about what is the purpose of a small group. What is the purpose of this recovery group or this support group? It doesn't, there is no right or wrong answer, a blanket answer, but each of us in our own ministry, in our own context, in our own church, there is a right and wrong answer. And so that's why we with our teams have to, I think, just with laser focus, define that. So a small group, it depends on your church. Is the primary purpose of small group Bible study? Is the primary purpose of a small group spiritual growth? If it is spiritual growth, how do you define spiritual growth?
Right.
And that's when we kind of enter this whole category of kind of spiritual health assessments, things like that. A lot of people have tried to put handles on that for very good purposes. And whatever handles we decide to use, it's just important that we have handles, because otherwise, like you said, we can kind of end up going 10 degrees in the wrong direction for a long time, and we end up in a completely different spot, and we find ourselves in a bind.
That's the tricky part, right? Because most of us probably, maybe I shouldn't say that. A lot of us have oversight over small groups, which may or may not include support groups. In my role at our size church, support is in a different department. You sit in the middle of both of those. You oversee both of those. But I think a lot of our listeners probably have both of them in their buckets too, which means then how do you draw those boundaries? And one of the things I think would be good to talk about is, even if you have a regular small group, however way our churches define that, I think there's some really great stuff for us to learn from support groups, John. It just seems like there's more transparency, maybe there's more vulnerability. I mean, what are some things you've seen that support groups do well in terms of not the actual content, but in terms of how they run and how they care for each other?
Yeah, you're talking about an important distinction of, we'll talk about sometimes process versus content. The content is different. Arguably, the content of any small group or any type of group compared to another is different, but the process is different too. And that's what we want to learn from. I think it is a tension to hold to oversee discipleship ministry and pastoral care ministry together. But it is truly a gift, because I think these two ministries can benefit so much from one another, in that the way God moves in either one is something we can learn and grow from if we're sitting in the other seat, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So what I love about our support groups, we kind of brand them as our pastoral care workshops at our church in our context, is, like you said, there's an authenticity and transparency. When you walk into a divorce recovery room and there's a bunch of small groups of people who are there, most of the people not wanting to be there, but having developed the courage to be in that room, there's a transparency there, because you're not going to keep a lot behind, that veil that we often have.
Right.
And so it's a gift for me to be part of that ministry, because I know what that authenticity can look like. And additionally, I feel like I have insight to the fear that probably most of us have walking into a normal small group, and we just don't show it as much. So that's one, authenticity. I think too, there's an intimacy that happens in these groups. When you share, sometimes I call it the deepest, darkest, with somebody.
Well, when you're so broken, like in an overt way versus we're all broken, but when you've had life has happened so, differently than you had hoped and it's just a mess. I think you have a openness, right? Because really you need help and you can't hide.
Yes. And the beauty of a support group or a recovery setting is that people walk in and that's their understanding. When I walk into a small group for the first time in somebody's beautiful living room and everybody looks, happy and is holding their Bible and their coffee.
The Facebook group.
It's easy to believe that everyone there has their stuff together. And what you find out, the beauty of group life ministry, that's why we're all involved in it, is that actually you spend a year with these people, you realize we're all a mess. Of course. We all need Jesus and we all need each other. But the fun part of a support group is that understanding happens in 5 minutes, not in 5 months.
So it's like fast forward. You just speed through the superficial stuff really quick.
It absolutely is. And as a result of that, I think another element that you have is there's a camaraderie in support groups, because when you've shared these painful things and seen healing and see God work in that. I always joke our recovery ministries laugh more than any other ministry in the church.
Interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like crazy. And it's because they're teammates. They support each other, right? They're doing hard work together, and that's understood. And so they work hard and they laugh hard, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So I think our small groups could definitely learn a lot from that.
Do you think sometimes the recovery type groups, the support groups, do they ever get stuck like in that mode where you just kind of marinate in that one brokenness in your life and that issue over and over again? Do you ever like kick people out and say, okay, you've gone through just going to divorce recovery 2 years now, it's time to move on, or just let people take it at their own pace?
Oh, it's so case by case, but in general, that is, you talk to any pastoral care person, and they can name, a handful of people who fall in that category. The names start popping into my head when you talk about that. And the same, I think, is true in any ministry. But what happens is in a care ministry, because it's in that middle category of healing, of fixing, it's noticeable when somebody just hangs out. Whereas I think any of us could name a lot of people who go to Bible, they're serial Bible study attenders and have studied the book of John 15 times with all these different people and haven't grown.
And they're just as stuck, Yeah,
they're just as stuck. I think it manifests in a little bit of a different way. And so it's a little more, you have a gut check feeling when somebody does that kind of in a support setting.
That's a great point. Because again, it's not what you know, right? It's what you actually put into practice. We have had cases where we've asked people to go through a support group first before they join a regular group. And we've done that where we've seen that area of their life, because they've just had a sudden trauma, emotional trauma, is just raw. And we just think, hey, to be supported by other people who get your story and understand and going through this would be a good thing. And they usually are thankful for that. But then sometimes we've had some pushback because they're like, I just want to be in a regular. People don't box me in and make me, a grief share person. But don't, this is more than this. But it's just, how do you manage that sort of discernment when people want to be in a group to decide, okay, which kind of group would be best for you?
I think it helps to kind of step back and think of, each and every one of us, unless you really grew up in a healthy church, if you have, like my story is, it wasn't until I was an adult that I started engaging in these types of ministries. So I can remember the first time I went to a small group and how actually terrifying that was, and on the surface I was calm and I was fine, but, inside you're asking yourself a million questions. Okay, so now take that and multiply it by 100, and you have somebody who is being encouraged to go to a support group or some sort of recovery group. It's threatening. It really is, and when it's threatening in a part of your life that's already experiencing a lot of pain and brokenness and confusion, I just have a lot of empathy and grace for people who are in that spot, because we've had the same thing where we, quote unquote, air quotes, highly encourage somebody to join, our pastoral care ministries before they join a group, or to go see a therapist or something.
Yes.
And I just know that for some people, that's a quick decision. They say, "Oh, absolutely, thank you for that encouragement.
Right.
I needed that prompting." And for some people, they look at you as if you've betrayed them.
Yeah.
And I just understand. It's there's a lot going on underneath the surface in that. And so just to let people marinate a little bit and keep in a relationship with you, if that's at all possible, or whoever they're working with at the time, and shepherd them through that, because it's a process. It's absolutely an acceptance process.
That's a good point. I think it is really a case by case. So we don't have a hard and fast rule, but we usually use it as a resource. Sometimes they do both. And that way that doesn't necessarily burden the regular group. I've heard you mention this a couple times now. And for us that are not therapists, maybe you could kind of define and break this down a little bit. You talked about baseline versus growth and what that is like. So would you explain that a little more? What do you mean by baseline? Absolutely. And what do you mean by us growing past that?
Yeah, okay, and you'll interrupt me if I get too nerdy, but in psychology, you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health, is what we use to diagnose people with mental illness, and since these social dilemmas and really like mental illness is not something you can do a genetic test for. It's not something that shows up kind of overtly. Any of these are what we call sometimes a constellation of symptoms. So I'm experiencing this, and this, and people who experience this, and this are what we would define as, depressed or generally anxious, things like that. So in every single one of those diagnoses, you have an indicator that says this person has lost significant functioning in either socially or at work or in school. So there's a loss of function. So when I'm looking at somebody kind of in the world of psychology who approaches me for help, the way I'm going to look at is, okay, what level of functioning have you lost? What relationships have you lost?
Because that's individual to each person, because your level, your baseline is different than my baseline is different than other people's.
So that's exactly it. You have to look at somebody and say, how is this impacting you in the backdrop of your life? I can't say, okay, Carolyn, you should be able to do this based on these other 10 people. That's not very fair.
Right.
But to say, okay, over the last 3 years, you've been experiencing this, and it has caused you, it's disrupted work, it's disrupted your friendships, it's disrupted your family. Okay, how do we get you back to baseline, back to where reasonably you should be? Is that helpful?
Yes. So in the church, okay, now for our small groups, we're not doing diagnostic tests on each other with personality disorders, because that probably wouldn't be super helpful. But but the idea is that, we're always talking about growth, right? And movement towards Jesus. So we're trying to encourage people in however way different churches do it, but towards growing to be more like Jesus. And is it that then the people's baseline, if they're in a regular small group, you would expect that the whole thing to move up? That they would become more loving, more caring, more, that's the journey, right? For the spiritual growth part?
Yeah, well, and actually, not to get too philosophical, but we would expect kind of the whole operating system to change. Paul writes to the Romans, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So not just growth, but in the church world, I mean, we're looking for transformation, that things would change positively for you is kind of the way to simplify it. Whereas, in a support setting, we're looking to get you back to where you reasonably should be in terms of your relationships, your, emotional kind of makeup and all of those things.
I wonder if in the church world, however, we tend to think that everyone's baseline should be a certain thing. Yes.
This is where I think the benefit of working in the world of pastoral care and discipleship at the same time, because ultimately, if I'm working with somebody with an addictive pattern to get them back to quote unquote baseline for them, or if I'm working with somebody who's leading a reasonable life and trying to help them find their spiritual next steps and grow in Christ, like growth is growth.
That's true. Yeah.
And we have a tendency, especially as our churches grow, to segment these things and to put them in different boxes, when in reality, there's so much to benefit from one another. And I think we mix them up like they are different things, when in reality, the dynamics that are necessary for each are very much the same. So at our church, our definition for spiritual growth, we talk about Philippians chapter 2, where we read, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ. And in 2 John, when it says, you must live as Christ lived, so we want to change our mind and our actions to be more like Jesus. Okay, so if I walk into, a Christian AA group, or if I walk into a Christian life group or community group, that call is the same. That definition doesn't change. It's just how we go about it, and the conversations that we have are very different. How we invite people into the group looks very different. How we train our leaders looks different. The covenant that we have on the front end for what we expect from our group members, it looks different. But really, the mechanics around what we're encouraging it should be, ideally, it should be the same.
That's true. That's a really good point. And then when you look at the life of Jesus, he didn't compartmentalize and go, okay, I'm on the healing part. So we're just going to do the healing part. Or right now, this is between you and your friends, or you and your parents. And so we're going to deal with you and the authority figures. It's very much all whole and holistic, right? So that makes more sense that you'd be able to do both. I like that.
Jesus used healing to teach. And at the same time, so he never separated discipleship and care, or his healing ministry. They're the same thing. They happen at the same time. We're not that good that often.
Jesus is very good at multitasking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he saved the world at the same time.
And he empowers his apostles to do the same, and this is where, when I say there's a great opportunity, it's sometimes risky business to encourage our small group leaders to help and support people kind of beyond the, let's just say, bread and butter small group stuff. Mm-hmm. But when they do, and if we coach them well while they're doing it, they're going to grow like crazy, and so is their group. And, if it's done well, of course, as you mentioned kind of on the front end of the podcast, there's a lot of situations where that can go awry, though.
Yeah, a lot of challenges. Well, I think this might be a good stopping point for us. I've asked John to be with me for part 2 of this conversation, because as we were talking about this and planning for this podcast, realized there was just so much valuable information that John could give us, and for us to continue this conversation about how do we care for people in our groups that are in crisis, that are more needy, quote unquote. And what does that even mean? So we're going to have part 2 of this conversation with John Noto, and so I encourage you to tune into that. But for this podcast, we'll sign off. We thank you so much for listening. And if you like what you hear, you can leave us a rating on iTunes, which helps other small group ministry leaders find us. And John, you can connect with him on his Twitter handle or Facebook, jonathan.noto, N-O-T-O, and also subscribing to his blog, unwavering.com. He's a terrific writer. You will enjoy that. And he also has a huddle in the Chicago area, and you can join him and other pastors in that area. So stay tuned for part 2, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.